I was recently called out for not having enough women on the podcast, and it's a very fair criticism. Out of the last 34 interviews that I have done this year, only 2 have been with women. So today, we're going to talk about diversity and data. So stay tuned. Everybody, welcome back to another Future Tech video podcast. The audio version of the podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, most of the others, or you can find it at futr.buzzsprout.com. Women are underrepresented in technology, and it can be a very difficult career path for women and for other underrepresented groups. Today, we're going to be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in technology and how that impacts the things that we build. And at the center of all that is data. And while this stuff isn't rocket science, today we've gone ahead and actually found us a rocket scientist to help us understand all of this. Dr. Colleen Tartow has a Ph.D. in astrophysics and is the director of engineering at Starburst Data, which provides a storage-free data access solution that allows people to access data where it lives. Welcome, Colleen.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thanks so much for coming. I just wanted to start off by just getting a little bit of a background about Starburst Data and where it all started and how it started and what were the founders of the company thinking?
Yeah. So our founders, led by Justin Borgman, who's our CEO, and our VP of product, Matt Fuller, to speak for them, they had a vision to allow customers to perform fast and secure analytics across any data, no matter where it lived. So really, analytics anywhere, that's our tagline. And our core product, Starburst Enterprise, is based on the popular open source project Presto, which was largely created by folks who work at Starburst. And it's now been renamed to Trino. So just to confuse things, but we call it Starburst Enterprise. And that was created at Facebook to solve the data and scalability challenges that are seen with these just massive quantities of data that you get at places like Facebook. And since then, Trino itself has gained viral adoption. Everybody uses it, and it's used everywhere. It's used at Netflix, LinkedIn, Twitter, anyone with massive quantities of data. So the company was launched in 2017. Starburst Enterprise was launched on AWS in 2018. And since then, we've launched on GCP, Azure, and of course, we support Kubernetes. So we're really everywhere.
That's awesome. Now, in talking with the folks at your company, I mean, it's an interesting culture. I think you guys are fostering at least you're fostering a conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion there, and I think you definitely have some people who are out there writing about this and speaking about this, and I think that's a really cool thing. And we're a big fan of like B Corps, in general, like socially responsible corporations and things like that. And while you're not that yet.
Not yet.
I think you guys are doing a lot of cool things on that front. So I wondered if you could maybe speak a little bit to sort of the culture of your company.
Absolutely. So our last valuation was 1.2 billion. So we're technically a unicorn, but we like to call ourselves Clydesdales. We are workhorses. We work hard. Doesn't mean we don't have fun too. We love our jobs, but culturally, our culture is built around hard work, and those who work hard and do good work get rewarded. And so when I arrived at the company, meritocracy was listed as one of the core values of the company. And I had a great few talks with our CEO about that, because I said, meritocracy is great, but it also assumes that everybody comes in the door from the same playing field and has the same chances. And so we had some really excellent conversations around that. And he and I actually co-wrote a blog talking about how we like the ideal of a meritocracy, but we recognize that that's ignoring certain challenges that a lot of people have. And so we changed the core value actually to an inclusive meritocracy. So the idea is that we still hold that ideal close to our hearts, but we also want to provide an environment where everyone can be judged on the basis of their hard work and who can find a way to thrive in our culture.
Yeah, I mean, and everybody's contribution can have value in different ways, right?
Yeah.
And I think the thing that's interesting about when you start having these kinds of conversations is that the contribution isn't always immediately recognized. One of the things I mentioned in the introduction was that it's without the appropriate representation of different groups of people, there's a bias in the way we build things, and we're building things, at scale for the world at large. But because we don't have the contribution of all types of people, we don't necessarily build the kinds of things that are going to best serve all types of people, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's countless examples of this, but the one that I always go back to, there's a couple actually. My favorite is, when Sally Ride was first going into space. You like rocket science, so I figure I'll throw this one in for you. The NASA scientists who were working on prepping her said, "We're going to give you for your 6-day trip 100 tampons. Is that enough?" And that is an absolutely ludicrous question. And it just goes to show that, like, if there had been a single woman on that team, that probably wouldn't have gone that far, right? Yeah. A more recent example, of course, being something like facial recognition, which works really well if you're white and male. And given that 51% of the planet's female, majority of the planet's non-white, that's actually a huge miss, right? So right. I would argue that if the teams building these technologies had been more diverse, it would have been found earlier, right? Like this wouldn't have happened in the first place.
Yeah, and I think it leads to some catastrophic mistakes too.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, more diverse companies, there's a billion statistics around this, right? But something like 5% of engineering leadership is female. And that's a ridiculously low number. And there's all sorts of reasons and arguments around why it is and how we can fix it, et cetera. But ultimately, it's about building better products, right? So having diversity of thought means having people from diverse backgrounds. And, that's how you build better products. And companies that are more diverse are shown to capture more new market, to be more innovative, and to have higher revenue. So it really is, there's a very basic business reason to do that.
Yeah. And on the flip side, the mistakes that you can introduce by not having that kind of input can be extremely costly as well.
Absolutely.
So this is Women's History Month. So I was kind of wanted to, we've kind of had a broad tent here in our early discussion here, but I want to kind of home in on women in technology. And you mentioned, 5% in engineering, which is ridiculously low. And I know that engineering leadership.
Yeah.
And we know that there's sort of a fall off in math and science and technology for girls around that age of 12. And, we see all sorts of challenges and obstacles for women in tech. And, like in being in tech for years and a long time now that I'm getting very old, I've seen sort of the progression of it, and it is very difficult for women. I mean, and people do make it very hard for women to get ahead in technology, and I've seen it myself. Could you speak a little bit about what you see on that front, and what you think may be some of the drivers for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely there's a lot of pieces to this, right? Like there's recruiting, and there's education, and there's promotions, and I think there are a few key things that any company can focus on to really help be more diverse and inclusive. And, just to be clear, diversity is having people from various backgrounds and various walks of life. Inclusion is making it such that your company is a place that anyone from any background can thrive, right? So the reason I distinguish between those two is because you can have diversity, but you may not be inclusive. And I think companies struggle with that in particular. And so they've started saying, well, diversity, equality, and or equity and inclusion, or DEIB, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Because it really is about making sure that at every level, at every job, you have people from various backgrounds, because you do end up with, there's something called the broken rung of the corporate ladder, where it's very hard for women and people of color to break into the management ranks. They tend to get to a senior level of individual contributor, and then they don't end up getting promoted at the same rate. Something like 2/3 of new promotions are going to people of the same demographic background, which means that you end up with fewer leaders. So I think companies need to be aware of all of these things, right? And to start to address them. And it doesn't mean just hire a new, chief diversity officer. It means like really making it part of the culture, the fabric of the company, which is what we're trying to do at Starburst.
So speak a little bit to that. How do you go about making that part of the culture of the company? I mean, Obviously, if you've done it with some of the hires you've made, because I know, one of your coworkers there, Jess Ian Diorio, is it? Yeah. I know she does a lot of writing on this topic. And I read a piece of hers that was talking about the she's not strategic problem. And so obviously you have a lot of people there who are kind of thought leaders on this and engaging the conversation. But, tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's about seeing people of color, women, people from these non-traditional or non-demographically accepted backgrounds as strategic, and having the capability to provide really high level influence into a company. And I mean, I think that gets back to the leadership question of like, if you look at the overall diversity of a company, it's one thing, but, for Apple, for example, Apple, is very diverse, but if you look at their leadership levels, the diversity drops off at each level. Right. And so, I think a lot of that gets back to sponsorship and mentorship. So mentorship being, somebody who helps you advocate for yourself, whereas sponsorship is somebody who will advocate on your behalf. And it's incredibly hard for women and people of color to find sponsors, whereas people from more traditional backgrounds don't have as much trouble. And to really have people sponsor you is key, to have people supporting you.
I had a really interesting conversation with somebody who's deeply involved in some of these initiatives, and she mentioned the concept of the reverse mentorship, where you find, person of color or, a marginalized person from a marginalized community, and they mentor the leadership of the company on, how best to, do these things, right? And give some perspective.
Yeah. I mean it's interesting, but it's kind of like putting the problem back on the person who's already receiving the problem in the first place, right? Like, it's not my problem that you don't hire more women. It's your problem. And so, of course, I'm obviously happy to help. But on the other hand, it's like, it's another, it's a hidden cost on us to have to like also do that in addition to our jobs. So, I see both the good and the bad on that one.
Yeah, it's sort of tricky because it is, and it's funny. We had Sandy Castro, who you may not know, but she leads an organization called IC Stars, and it's Inner City Computer Stars. And so basically, she helps people from marginalized communities gain skills to get into a technology position and enter the technology workforce. And she was talking about how she was at a conference where Jimmy Carter was the key speaker, and it was about, I think it was about sex trafficking, if I recall the conversation. And Jimmy Carter said, "You all need to go and talk to your husbands." And of course she was like, "What are you talking about? I talk to my husbands." It's like, and he's like, "Look, men control this situation. Men are the problem. And if men don't help to participate in addressing this issue, we are not going to solve some of these problems." Because I mean, the people in power are the ones who really ultimately need to change, right? And so unless we're all, I suppose, engaging them in the conversation, we're not going to get to where we need to be, as I think what the thought there was.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that. And I mean, I think educating folks and getting them to be allies is a key piece of this because it's the first step, but it's not the only step. And I think that's the challenge is, you don't want to like just be like, well, I posted something about Black Lives Matter to Instagram, so we're good, like racism done. That's not how it works, right? So, yeah, I think there's a lot to it. And being an ally is an incredibly important first step.
Yeah. Well, and you speak a little bit to sort of the performative nature of this conversation, and I worry about that with what we're doing here. I mean, I don't want it to be a sort of performative act, but I mean, I'm a white male in tech, and I am part of the problem, right? I've had 2 women on out of 34 guests, and in my defense,
that's okay. You're doing better.
It's hard.
Do better.
I need to do better. I do need to do better. And in my defense, I mean, it is a little hard to find women represented in, tech sometimes.
I'll give you a
at leadership.
I'll give you a list.
Yeah, no, I would love a list actually.
Yeah, I will absolutely give you a list of people.
Yes. And I would love to have them on because I do think it matters.
Yeah. And I think, even from a recruiting standpoint, like I'm hiring, right? Come work for us. It's my little spiel. But I'm hiring, and for every one person of color, I get, 50 resumes of non-people of color, right? So it's like, I feel it too. I very much feel it too. But that just means I have to work harder at recruiting in places that I wouldn't normally recruit. And companies have this issue all the time. If you only hire referrals, you're just going to get a bunch of people who look the same and think the same and act the same. And again, then you end up with your problems around product, right? Like that you end up with a product that just works one way. And so it just means that we have more work to do. I have more work to do sourcing candidates from different places, like outside the box, think outside the box of just my LinkedIn network, for example.
Yeah, well, and it, I think that the challenge too is it puts us all out of our comfort zone, right? I mean,
good.
Having conversation about this is difficult, and it sometimes does, like for me, come to some realizations that I need to do better, and that is, but better to have the conversation than not.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, change is uncomfortable, but it's also good, right? So,
right.
Yeah.
So on that front, one of the Starburst Data is a data company, and I think one of the big challenges we see in data is how poorly it represents everyone in the world, we've got too much data and not enough data all at the same time, right? Yeah. And I know you're kind of a data geek, so. Yeah. I would love to hear your perspective on how representation impacts data.
Oh, absolutely. When you think about bias in data, there are several different ways it gets introduced, right? Like, I found 3 main places, I guess. So like from the data itself, from the algorithms that you can introduce. And I mean, we've seen that with I think it was, I don't want to say who, I think it was Amazon, but it might not have been. So I apologize if it wasn't, but their recruiting algorithms were, pre-selecting white men or something like that, or male candidates. But so from the algorithms themselves, and then also, that's just data. Humans are interpreting the data. So the data can be biased, the algorithms can be biased, and the humans can be biased. So, thinking about the data, it's how is the data collected? Survey data is the easiest data to bias, right? Like any data where you're asking people for their human behavior and you're selecting a group of people, you're going to end up with selection bias and confirmation bias, where you're sampling the data incorrectly, or you're using data to just prove your pre-derived assumptions, right? The algorithms, like I said, can amplify those biases, but they can also find for false correlations. Like algorithms aren't thinking, right? Like we call it machine learning. They're not actually learning. They're doing what we tell them to do. And so then that brings us to the third one, which is the human bias, where we're interpreting things and we're bringing our own experiences and bias to that. So I think being aware of that Again, the first step is acknowledging you have a problem. But then also, if you have a diverse group of people doing the algorithms and collecting the data and making the inferences out of those results of the algorithms, then you'll have people, if you have people from a variety of backgrounds, they'll be able to work together, which will inherently eliminate some of that bias.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I'm aware of bias in the things that I look at and do and how I introduce bias. And even being aware of it, I notice that I can't overcome it. So this is a really challenging problem. And, you mentioned AI/ML and some of the biases that are just sort of inherent to doing that. And I like part of it is like, we're building these AIs that have built-in bias, but on the other hand, in some regards, AI is the tool that we're using to help us try to ferret out some of that bias, right? It's like beer. It's the cause of and the solution to all my problems, right? So I mean, yeah. What how do you think we get past this bias issue?
I mean, I think everyone is biased, right? There is not a single person on this planet who does not have biases. And, you're never going to be conscious of all your biases, but trying to be is the first step. And then, like I said, like having a diverse group of people building your products means that in some ways, maybe their biases will cancel each other out, or they can call each other out on biases. But I think that's really the trick, is having that diversity of thought and diversity of voice when it comes to anything you're doing, like whether it be leadership or writing machine learning models, right?
Well, and data is a complex topic, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things that we've seen, I mean, like, so my sister is a Ph.D. in statistical sociology, right? So nice. She's a stats and data geek too. So, that's why it's all close to my heart. But, like when we talk about data and how to process and analyze data, I mean, there's so much complexity to it. And I think, well, here's somebody who's got a PhD. Here's you who's got a PhD. Not everybody can go and get a PhD in data science or astrophysics and like kind of come in and try to solve for these problems. So, and especially outside of major markets, finding people who have the expertise and knowledge to sort of even start to address these issues is a real challenge. So I worry that there's just not or ever going to be enough people to really address this problem. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, that may be true, but we have to try, right? We have to try. We have to, I mean, this is why I talk to young women about science and math, and I, lecture the 7-year-old girl across the street about how cool math is, because I'm like trying to influence her. But, I mean, I think that especially those of us who are a woman director of engineering, right? Like, I have to get out there and talk to people and show them that there is someone who looks like them and thinks like them who can do this job. And there's no reason they can't either. Right. So I think, we just have to keep trying, and we'll get better. And I think things have gotten better. I mean, past 50 years, things have certainly changed.
Yeah, and I think that's a great perspective, because I think a lot of times when we have these conversations, everything is doom and gloom. And I'm sure you're probably familiar with Hans Rosling, who I adore, and he wrote that book Factfulness, which I think was really helpful to me, because he's like, look, things are getting better. It's okay. It's going to be okay. Things are trending in the right direction. We got a lot to fix, but things are trending in the right direction. So, working for Starburst Data, I think you guys are doing something that's really interesting. And we talked with, Justin Borgman, your co-founder and CEO of the company, a couple days ago. And, he was talking about sort of, the data anywhere kind of aspect of Starburst and what you're doing. And I think, one of the ways that we address some of this problem, you guys are kind of attacking some of the fundamental problems of what we're talking about. One is like the access to a breadth of data and integration of data that's going to give us better insights and predictive models. But also the ability to clean and parse some of that data, so you're you're making it more actionable, more usable before you're even doing the analytics on it, right? So, I mean, could you kind of speak to sort of the mission of what you guys are doing and some of the things that you're taking on here?
Yeah, data obviously is growing out of control. The data sprawl is real, and so as these data volumes are growing just exponentially into astronomical volumes, the data itself is becoming increasingly diverse, right? And so that really accentuates the need to be more nimble and keep the time to value of data to a minimum. So basically what I mean by that is the distance between the data and the value from the data, we need to keep as short and efficient as possible. And so I have worked for companies where I've built these like incredibly complex data pipelines where you're moving data, around the world and, building these living, breathing pipelines that if they break, the models go down and everything is broken. But, after years of doing that, I kept thinking there's got to be a better way. And so I learned about Presto and I was like, I'm interested in that. And so when I came to Starburst, I was very excited because I do feel like we're taking that like modern data stack paradigm and flipping it on its head and focusing on like what is really the business value here, which is the ability to make data-driven decisions and really focus on providing the data to the business as fast as possible without all the malarkey of like, oh, well, I was going to use data to make this decision, but the pipeline broke, which I've seen happen, right? So I think that, there is a diversity story there too, that just like making sure people can get the data that they need and making it accessible. Our tagline is analytics anywhere, because it really is about, whether the data is in a mainframe or data center, or it's in the cloud in, some Oracle or Parquet storage, right? Like you want to be able to get it and combine data from these different sources without having to build a complex pipeline. And, so I think that's really what our company is focusing on. And I think it's an incredible journey.
Yeah, I think you guys had some white papers on your website, and there's one that I was reading about sort of the state of data from 2021 or something. But there's something interesting that sort of jumped out at me in there that I think I'm seeing personally, and I think it's a really interesting piece of it. It said 51% of respondents indicated having data in 5 or more different platforms, which is obviously a big increase, but. Mm-hmm. What I'm actually seeing is way more than 5 platforms. Mm-hmm. I'm seeing, and when you take into consideration the expansion of SaaS and all the data that's living there. I mean, we had one customer that's, we were talking to them, they're like, oh, we have about 2,000 different SaaS platforms that we're working with. Wow. And a week or so ago, I talked to another customer who said they have over 12,000 different SaaS applications that they're using. I mean, think about that, right? I mean, you talk about data sprawl. I mean, I don't even know how you get to 12,000, but it's a very large corporation, right? So I get it, but wow, that's a lot of data living in a lot of different places. Yeah. That's really completing the picture of what you're going to do. Mm-hmm. So I think this data enrichment piece that you're talking about is really, really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, not all 12,000 data sources are going to be the things that your exec team is using to make their decisions about the direction of the company, but being able to figure out like, what are the questions that people are asking? That is really what it gets down to, right? Like, what are the questions people are asking that need to be data driven, right? Like, how are we calculating X, Y, and Z? And making sure that that is a repeatable, robust, reliable calculation and that you can tweak it as needed. That's actually a very challenging thing for most companies. And so being able to like reduce that time to value for data is just so important.
Yeah. And I think, in addition to all those data sources that a company might itself be generating, there's external data sources that you have to start integrating, right? If you really, especially when you're getting in the machine learning and deep learning world, you really need to draw from a lot of disparate sources to flush out that data picture. What do you guys do around like helping people? You've got this whole data pipeline, that you can manipulate and adjust and funnel data to different sources and things like that. I mean, can you talk about how that the data enrichment piece and sort of moving the data to where it needs to be, like how that's very beneficial to, getting to those conclusions?
Yeah. And I mean, I think there's data that you have to replicate because you need to push it into a data lake or a data warehouse. But then there's data that you have to replicate because you have to move it out of whatever third-party source it's in, right? And so the idea of being able to join those two things together and then bring in legacy data or, cold storage or whatever you have, being able to just refer to a data catalog wherever it lives is really, that agility around extraction of data is what you need. And so you don't want to have long, complex pipelines where, it takes 2 weeks for a data engineer to even get you, a test version of the data, right? You want to just be able to point at it and call it a day. And so, so that's really what Starburst is enabling, is the ability to just not necessarily even have to replicate your data, right? No, you won't necessarily even need ETL.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, because we talk about data lakes, but, a lot of data lakes are data sinkholes or data black holes, right? So
swamps.
Data swamp or data black hole. Let's go with data black hole.
Yeah, like
to keep with the astrophysics theme.
Yeah.
And in that regard, I think we're sort of, just sort of teasing at the things that sort of linger about the event horizon that sort of, that are busting out, high energy, they look very attractive because they're easiest to get at, right? And getting to the core of that and leaving the data in the data lake that's more actionable by an organization, I can see have tremendous value.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, in addition to this, I mean, we've seen just this huge amount of data silos. There's this exponential organic growth of data, and we've talked about how data sort of feeds on itself. So we've kind of got this sort of Malthusian distribution where we've got data sort of growing exponentially, and our ability to interpret and analyze and refine it is maybe not entirely linear. I would say that as we make innovation, we kind of hockey stick up for a bit and then kind of return to linearity.
Yeah.
How do you envision getting getting caught up to that curve, or is it important?
I do think it's very important, and I think that there's this term, the modern data stack, which I don't love because I don't think it's particularly modern. But the idea of data coming from some transactional system, or whether third-party SaaS or mainframe or whatever you have, data coming from that system needs to be copied somewhere, transformed, loaded somewhere, transformed, like ETLT, wherever the T goes, and then it can be curated and ready for analytics. There's a lot of steps along the way there. And that paradigm and that movement of data, it came from 15 years ago, where that was the way hardware led us, right? You couldn't keep the data at the source because you would affect performance, and you couldn't pull the data together in memory because the machines didn't have enough memory. So I feel like we need to move away from that in a way. And so there's a lot of managed services and cloud infrastructures that has gotten us away from a lot of that. And that's fantastic. But even just the overall paradigm of having to replicate your data and having to copy it and pull it all together before you can do analytics on it, or before you can even start exploring it, I think we need to get away from that. And so that's why I'm at Starburst, right? It's I want to solve the problems and stop looking backwards at what we've been doing, and let's start looking forwards at what are the problems we really want to solve.
Yeah, because I mean, you mentioned earlier that the data that we're working with is largely white American males, and there's 9.5 billion other people on the planet that are not being entirely represented, or 8.5 billion, I would suppose, probably a better number, but. So there's obviously a lot more data about to hit us. And I think one of the things that you guys are doing that's interesting is the ability to take real-time data and integrate stored data and saved data and historical data into that feed and produce, richer data sources. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's another thing that's only going to get more significant going forward, is that, everybody's got 12,000 SaaS platforms that they're collecting data from. And, if you can combine real time with legacy, you can really exponentially advance your knowledge of what's going on in your company, because you can start looking at trends, you can start looking at where you're going. And that gets into sort of like the predictive and prescriptive side of analytics, of like, how do we turn the ship by, adding data in. Sorry, I'm not trying to refer to what's going on with the Suez Canal right now, but
very timely though.
Yeah, very timely. But I would say that, the rate of data production is just, it's exponentially growing, right? And so it's accelerating, and companies need to stop looking at what we've traditionally done and start looking forward at, making sure they're leaving their options open for the future, that they're not getting locked into vendors, that they're using extensible formats for data that can not only be combined with legacy data, but that can be combined with some format that we don't even know about yet, right? Like really just leaving our options open. And I think that's key.
Yeah. So, one of the other things that I'm seeing on the rise, I mean, obviously we're processing a lot of data, and organizations are increasingly becoming data driven. And, we kind of spoke a little bit to this earlier, but the sort of appropriate governance around our data. I mean, because there's a lot of issues with it, right? I mean, just from a regulatory and compliance perspective, but even, like what are we building, from an ML, perspective, we're seeing the rise of ethics review boards and things like that. How do you think this is all going to play out? How does that all play out in companies going forward, do you think? That's kind of a big question to ask, but
that is a big question. I like it though. I definitely think that the more data we have, the more times we're going to see this happen, that we're going to start to say, like, how much are we being tracked? How much are we being pandered to based on the data that they have for us, whatever they is, right? Whether it's,
right,
a social media company or a grocery store or your doctor, right? Like, how can we really trust what we're being told? And it all gets back to trust in data, because you have to have faith in the data, but then again, like, I don't have faith in a company necessarily the same way I do in facts, which is what data is. So I definitely think that we're going to see more and more of that, and the capability of companies to use data responsibly is going to be really interesting going forward.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a challenging piece of it. And as you sort of alluded to, there are we talk about all this data sprawl, in the world, but there's also the aspect that some of this data is, cloistered. It's being held tightly by private corporations that have probably more information about us than anybody in our lives, and what does that mean?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I go back and forth on this too, right? Like, I have children and I'm like, what's out there about them? I'm very private about that. And so it's, it's scary in some ways thinking about all the data. Then you sort of step back and you're like, well, I'm a reasonable person. Like, what could possibly be out there about me? But it is about privacy. And I think having, we've got CCPA now, where you've got the right to be forgotten and the right to demand that, you get rid of your data about me, right? And I think that is a really interesting piece of legislation that I don't think that's the last time we've seen something like that come out. So that's an interesting thing too. And that's another reason you need something where you can search all of your data to make sure that you've forgotten someone and be able to prove that you've done that. So
yeah, I think that's tricky though. What does that entirely mean? Is that only data that's associated with your name or your social security number? Or is that data that could be de-anonymized about you too, right?
I mean, yeah, they can, any company could be de-anonymizing data, but then if it can't be traced back to you, are you still worried about it?
Yeah, but the data's still there, right? So that whole right to be forgotten, and you look at, I mean, there's in the security space, there's sort of that that problem with encryption, right? We know that there's certain 3-letter agencies out there that are building huge data centers to store an enormous amount of encrypted data that they can't today decrypt. Right. So just because something is what it is today doesn't necessarily mean that in the future it's not going to be something dangerous. Right.
True.
And I think, we talk about the kids. Kids have a different relationship to data now than we do.
They do. Yeah.
And they're more free with it.
Yeah. True. And that terrifies me. But,
it is a little scary.
It probably terrifies every parent, right? Like what's out there. So.
But on the other hand, maybe they're going to run the world in a little bit, so maybe we should look to them as to what we should, how we should relate to each other in this, because ultimately that's what it's about: how we relate to the information that we get about somebody. How do we, interact with that and how do we, relate that to the person that's being talked about?
Yeah, true. Without that interpretive layer, it's all just ones and zeros, right?
Yeah, we are. It's a bit of a challenging environment. Yeah. So tell me, we've been talking a little bit about Starburst data and some of the cool things that you guys are doing on that front. Tell me, where do you see your key use cases, differentiators? Tell me a little bit about the company from that perspective.
So I alluded to this a little bit already, but it's really about how to get business value out of data in the most reliable, efficient way possible. And so really understanding how quickly value can be extracted from data, but also being able to repeat those measurements. And so, I think the fact that Starburst Enterprise runs on data anywhere, it's in the cloud, it's on-prem, it's across hybrid and multi-cloud environments, and in any system, whether it's a data warehouse or a data lake or a lake house or whatever you have, or a source system, the fact that it can run anywhere is really powerful. And, we're now available on all the major clouds. And so you can really just get going and start analyzing your data very quickly without having to build out an entire, infrastructure and pipelines and all that good stuff. And just a little sneak peek, my team is working on something called Starburst Galaxy, which is a managed service offering of Starburst Enterprise. And so it's going to make it even faster, right? So your time to value for data could be on the order of hours as opposed to days or weeks, right? So we're really excited about that. That's in early access right now.
Oh, that's cool. And that sort of was going to be my next question there is, what's coming up for you guys?
Yeah, no. So definitely on the enterprise side, it's things like, faster data lake capabilities, multi-cloud, hybrid cloud analytics. So really if you have some data in GCP, some data in a data center and something else in Azure, you can go cross cloud, right? That hybrid cloud analytics, right? And I think for larger corporations, that's incredibly essential. We're also working on more security, more data governance solutions so that, we can really provide secure access to data wherever it is. And then Starburst would be your single point of access for all of your data. And then, obviously I'm partial to the things my team is building, but the Starburst Galaxy is going to just, it's going to be the most important piece of software ever. That's all. So
that's awesome. Well, I mean, I love the idea of getting more access to data. We just talked about encryption, and this is totally aside now, but I'm losing the plot. But one of the concepts that always intrigues me is homomorphic encryption, and the ability to make changes on encrypted data without actually decrypting the data and exposing the data. Is that ever anything that's going to be on your radar?
We've talked about it. I don't know that it's on the roadmap, but it's definitely something we've chatted about. So
that could be a cool product.
It's interesting. I mean, it's an interesting.
Yeah, I mean, especially since for the way that your product works, that ability would be really compelling, I would think.
Obviously, we've learned, Colleen, from you that Starburst is a different company. You're not just from the culture, the market you're going after, everything else. But what I also found interesting is you guys are an East Coast-based company. And you see a lot of startups happening out of the Valley, right? And so people just kind of associate the Valley, as the place for all technology, right? So what has that journey been like for you guys? I don't know if you've worked with Silicon Valley companies in the past, but what is it like trying to be a technology company in Boston?
Well, we're definitely not lonely. We have a lot of big startups here and a lot of big companies, so it's not like we're alone here.
Sure.
And I've definitely worked with companies in the Valley. Actually, our investors, most of them are out in the Valley. So, I think we're definitely making a splash East Coast and West Coast, which I like to think about. But awesome. The founders who wrote Presto, the original creators of Presto, work for Starburst now, and they're all ex-Facebook. So they're here now. But, we will be having, a Palo Alto office or something like that, I'm sure, when, things get back to the new normal. But yeah, we're definitely, we're everywhere. We're analytics everywhere. So, yeah. But, I've lived in New England my whole life. And so for me, this is, I definitely see us as sort of like the East Coast version of Silicon Valley here in Boston. And, there's definitely tons of startups around.
Well, before there was Silicon Valley, there was Boston, right?
Yep. The 128 loop.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's, so I'm born and raised Chicago. Mm-hmm. So is Chris. And I straight out of college, I went to the Valley for 4 years, and then I moved to Chicago. And I just, the one thing for sure is that Chicago and still is, we were a few years behind Silicon Valley. So some of the things that Chris and I've talked about, some of our like audacious, big dreaming goals is that we want Chicago to be a technology hub. Mm-hmm. We have great schools here. You got Northwestern, University of Chicago. You got great transportation. It's a great culture for young people. Yeah. It's just we've been more in this manufacturing and finance and that fast kind follower. Of
the jungle.
Yeah, exactly.
Jungle, yeah. Hopefully not like that anymore.
No.
Yeah.
I would hope not. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's great. I wish you guys the best of luck with that, because I think technology is obviously the future of the world, and the more and more cities and areas that we have, the more diversity that we have. Just outside of just this one little area of Silicon Valley, right? And then there's all of us.
Yeah. Well, I would also say
it's exciting.
The pandemic has changed things, right? Like Starburst is a hybrid company. There is a Boston office. There will be a San Francisco office. We have an office in Warsaw, Poland. I have people on my team from all over the world, right? Like I just hired someone in Brazil. I have somebody in Panama, somebody in London. I can hire anywhere now, and it's much more accepted than it was 18 months ago to be like, oh, this person's in North Carolina, no big deal, right? And so I think that really opens the doors to a more diverse workforce, and it really allows you to look for people with the right technical skill sets, but with different backgrounds, and that gives you that capability to really up the diversity of thought of your team.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting benefit that's come out of all of this is the ability to access talent wherever it is. Mm-hmm. Although one of the things that we get reminded of is that that the ability to participate at that level is not uniform across the globe, right? Mm-hmm. The ability to access the technology to do that is limited for some people. So it's as much as it's democratizing some of that, it's still not quite enough, unfortunately.
Yeah, we're not quite there, but we're getting there. We're getting closer anyway.
You talked about in the podcast about how hard this conversation is, and these conversations, whether it be about women in tech or racism or politics or whatever. There's so much division in our world these days. We're just, as much as we're all human beings and we're all the same, we for some reason like to create divide with each other, and I just don't really understand that at all. Yeah. In all different ways. But it is hard conversations, and for me personally, I'm dipping my toe into the conversations. I'll go to Chris and say, how do we handle this? Yeah. I need some tools. I need some education here because I want to have the conversations, but I don't know if I have all the tools that I need to have them. You know what I'm saying?
I mean, I when I'm in situations like that, I tend to just jump right in, and maybe that's not the best tactic, but I'm like, hey, let's talk about it, because if it's uncomfortable, maybe you can get to a place of comfort by having the conversation. So exactly. That's what I tend to do. But
Yeah.
And it's interesting because when you get in those conversations, minds change.
Yeah.
And like for me personally, there's been times where I've gone to Chris and been like, here's a scenario, right? Does that mean that I'm racist? Like what does that mean?
Yeah.
And then we would talk about it, know? And then I finally understood what Chris was trying to tell me and explain to me. And now I feel better about having some of these conversations.
Yeah. So I was just going to say, like, there's so much going on in the world. And, it's not just about like data and databases. It's about, there's a lot of data coming at us at all times. Like I've got my Twitter thing on my watch and, like I've just got like information coming me at all times. It's a different world, right? Like things have changed. And we have to try to sort through that data. It's the same thing our computers are doing, right? We're trying to sort through that data and get value out of it and figure out, what's important to us and what can make us happy and good people. So
Colleen, thanks so much for coming on and in upping our number to 3, which is it's not great, but it's a start, right?
50% higher.
Yes, it is. Well, that you're doing the math because I'm not the most mathletic, so I appreciate that. But no, really, honestly, thank you for such a great, insightful conversation. I look forward to having more conversations with you in the future. I really want to applaud you guys for not just the work you're doing on the product that you're building, which is pretty cool. But the culture of the company as well. And, who knows, maybe you'll get a few more resumes after all this.
Yeah,
so thank you so much. Yeah. Thanks so much
you
for being on.
This has been super fun. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, it's been fun. Sandesh. Thanks for watching. If you like what you saw, click on that like button, hit the subscribe button because that helps the channel a ton. And if you want to get notified when we post new content, click on that bell icon and you will be notified. And I will see you in the next video.